Hello, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. It's an honor and a privilege, a very happy occasion for all of us in this colloquium, and very especially for me to welcome two important and brilliant thinkers of utopianism in our times, both of whom have inspired our own studies for decades and been a source of continued insights. A huge thank you to our guests today, Professor Raffaella Baccolini, who is speaking from Bologna, and Professor Tom Moylan, who is speaking from Limerick, Ireland. Thank you very much for having accepted our invitation. And thank you all who are supporting, who are following the sessions in our academic event, which is part of the celebration of the 20th anniversary of the Literatura Utopia group. A special thanks to Fantastica 451 and all the team of Fantastica, who are partners in holding this conversation. Our interviewers are two researchers, active members of Literatura Utopia, and also members of the Fantastica 451 editorial team, Elton Furlanetto and Felipe Benicio. Elton is in transition time, since he will join the staff at Universidade Federal do Mato Grosso do Sul very soon, right? So he's moving from São Paulo to Mato Grosso. Besides being a researcher, he's also a translator who is now working on Pierce's Woman on the Edge of Time. Okay, I hope this is, published very soon. Good luck in your new job, Elton.
Thank you.
And Felipe Benicio, who is a poet, who has an MA on literary studies, and now a researcher carrying on his PhD work with us at Universidade Federal de Alagoas, working specifically with dystopian fictions, contemporary dystopian fictions. Now I'm going to introduce our guests, starting with Raphaela. Raffaella Baccolini is a full professor at Bologna University, and she coordinates the PhD program on translation, interpreting, intercultural studies. Her research areas are contemporary and 20th century American and English literature, as well as gender studies. In particular, she has published on women's literature, feminist criticism, utopia, dystopian science fiction, modernism, memory and nostalgia, trauma studies, young adults literature and cinema. I would highlight two of her works that have been that we have read and reread so many times. One is Gender and Genre in the Feminist Critical Dystopias of Catherine Burdekin, Margaret Atwood, and Octavia Butler, a classic in SF, utopian dystopian studies. More recently, she published Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, 2017 to the present, women's dystopian science fiction. So she's rereading Margaret Atwood in this more recent piece. In connection with the research we carry out here in Brazil, she contributed a chapter on women's dystopias for Utopias Sonhadas, Dystopias Anunciadas, a book that came out last year. Thank you very much, Rafaela, for being part of this project. This book, Utopias Sonhadas, was organized by Luciana de Plania, Universidade Federal da Paraíba, and myself. Rafaela is a member of METRA, co-editor of the Ralaheim Utopian Studies series, and of the online journal Mediação. Now moving to Professor Tom Moylan. Thank you, Rafaela, for accepting. Professor Tom Moylan has been my interlocutor since the 90s, so it's a very long story. I'm not going to tell again, but he has had a very strong impact in my academic life since the PhD research in Glasgow at Strathclyde University. I found in Demand the Impossible, his 1986 book, an inspiration and a basis for my own theorizings on gendered critical dystopias. Now, those initial encounters happened between the publication of two of his major works, and I'm going to mention those works. Demand the Impossible, published in 1986, and The Scraps of the Untainted Sky, Science Fiction, Utopia, Dystopia, published in 2000. Let me show you. Some people may not know that our research group has published the theoretical part, has translated and published the theoretical part of Scraps in this book. Okay. Ruth Levitas, in her opening words to his latest publication, said that both Demand and Scraps are an indispensable contribution for science fiction, utopian, dystopian studies, and I could not agree more. I've mentioned his latest publication. I would like João Vitor to show the image, the cover image to us. So this is his 2020, okay, his latest book called Becoming Utopian, The Culture and Politics of Radical Transformation, which I had the pleasure to read, and I am already thinking about, further projects based on his new, more recent work. And just to close this introduction, I copied from his Twitter. I found it lovely, so I'm going to read what is there in his Twitter profile. He says, I'm a utopian citizen, a writer, a teacher, Professor Emeritus and founding director of the Rallahine Center for Utopian Studies, University of Limerick. Always becoming utopian. This is beautiful. And both Professor Moylan and Professor Baccolini have works that converge in many ways, but I'm not going to get into details because of time reasons. We want to listen to you, but I'll mention their work, only their work, as founding members of the Rallahine Center for Utopian Studies, and the joint editorial work they carry on together for the Rallahine Utopian Studies series. There is also a major publication called Dark Horizons, published in 2003, that is also a landmark work organized by the two of them. So they've got a very long and beautiful story of joint work and research. And I'm going to thank you again for being here, sharing your recent ideas, your experiences, your recent ideas about utopia, dystopia, those topics that bring us together. And I'm passing on the word now to Elton Furlanetto and Felipe Benicio to start this interview. Thank you very much.
Okay, hello, good afternoon. One more time, I would like to thank Moylan and Baccolini for accepting our invitation and being with us here today. Okay, so I'm going to start the questions. Yeah, and this first question is for both of you, okay? So, in the last years, particularly in the second decade of the 21st century, the word dystopia has become part of the contemporary society's vocabulary, being employed in many and different contexts, sometimes even detached from its literary history. As it is, the word dystopia seems to translate the fears and anxieties that grew out of the economic, political, ecological crisis we are facing at this very moment. As academics, how do you understand dystopia today? Has your understanding changed in more recent? And for you, is it only a literary genre or subgenre? Or can we use it to describe certain moments of human history, like most people are doing right now?
Okay, I'll begin. First of all, by thanking you, Felipe, for your question, and you and Elton for conducting this, and particularly a thanks to Ildney for your very kind invitation and your introduction, and for the ongoing collaboration, both in the Becoming Utopian project and this one, and in the dystopia translation. So it's a real honor to be here, for us to be here with our Brazilian colleagues as part of this conference, and particularly part of this celebration. We need to do more celebrating because the work is hard and the times are dark, so celebration is important. And it goes without saying that it's always a pleasure to work with Raffaella and for us to be together for this session. This is something we've done together for a very long time and will continue doing. Ildney, you mentioned the Dark Horizons project, which really coalesced Raffaella's work on the critical dystopia and mine, and led to the ongoing conversation that really is happening here today. But the other book that I think is important in the Rallahine series is Utopia Method Vision. And that's one of the first collections and studies that really started to address the question of utopia as a method, not just as a scholarly hermeneutic method, but as a way of being in the world. And it very much, for me, led to what Becoming Utopian finally appeared as. So what I'm talking a bit more here than I hope to for the rest, because I think what will happen from here on out will be our usual sharing and our usual conversation, a twining, an intertwining, or what Marge Piercy would call a braiding of our thoughts and our contributions. And we look forward to your questions and the questions from the audience. So to come to your question, Felipe, yes, our understanding of dystopia has indeed changed in recent times because of the historical conditions and the very mobilization of dystopia that you speak to. For us, dystopia is still fundamentally a term for a distinct literary genre. It's a formal and interpretive category with a particular history and formal characteristics, but also an evolving presentation as times change, and as we'll be speaking to as we go on this evening, and it is evening here. But we want to start today by stepping back into what you were identifying, and that's the ways in which the term dystopia, more often now as an adjective rather than a noun, is used to describe present-day social reality. For our concern, and the concern you imply in your question, and the concern of many, is that this adjectival description floats on the surface, a representational surface of that reality. And it does not bring in the great capacity of epistemological critique of which the dystopian imaginary is capable. So this recent dystopian attribution has tended to be then a mechanism of reassurance and compensation, and no longer one of critique and transformation. It's the object of a process of commodification, or as we'll be saying, commercialization, that's really part of everyday consumer neoliberal culture. So that, to use Ruth Levitas's terms in concept of utopia, it's working more as a compensatory form rather than an emancipatory one. In this light, the capitalist processes of alienation and exploitation have rendered the dystopian imaginary, have cleansed it of its critical and visionary potential. and turned it into a way of evoking and producing and reproducing a repeated pleasure rather than a spiral one. A repeated pleasure that Vandana Singh, the science fiction writer, has called dystopia porn. So that what we get are dark mirrors of reflection, but surface reflection rather than a critical prism. So our concern is that this contemporary form, adoption, commodification, alienation of dystopia works as a form of moral inoculation rather than a way to generate political outrage or a challenge. And I think that's enough for me, and we'll start the conversation. To Raffaella.
Okay, thanks. Let me briefly thank Ildney and Elton and Felipe as well. But I'll get into and it's really a great pleasure to be here and to see you after so much time. I, obviously agree with what Thomas said. We've been working on together. We've been talking about these things for so long. I think, one of the things, dystopia's changed for sure. And one of the things that are different about dystopia today is that it doesn't really talk about the future, but it's more like a representation or a description of the present. The recent dystopias are very much set almost in the near, in the present, not really in the future. So, and it's certainly still a literary genre. I couldn't agree more. But we'll talk about it perhaps a little bit more later. But as also Tom was saying, it's been used mostly as an adjective, right, to describe the present, and I also think that this is a way of, in a way, diminishing the radical power of dystopia, of making it, of taming it, and this is, as compelling as it may be to describe the times that we are experiencing as dystopian, because we do feel that we're living in, we certainly are living in dystopian times. But there's a risk of, that everything becomes dystopian in the same way that in recent years, everything was used, utopia was used to describe pretty much any kind of desire, right? And even like a cruise would be an example of utopia, or a jewel, or anything really. And so anything, if anything can become dystopian today, it kind of neutralizes, right, its estranging features, and it neutralizes the critical component as well. Maybe Tom, you want to add something?
With the way in which the cultural reproduction and the marketing mechanisms of a capitalist system are always looking for a new way to deliver a product and make a product. And I think dystopia in these times has been turned into that in the way Raffaella has described, so that it's now more of often a fashion statement, and a behavioral statement that reinforces a kind of a dark nihilist adjustment to everyday dark life rather than any kind of pushback against it, so that it describes but it doesn't explore. And it's something then that people can very much enjoy, because you can just, to put it roughly, wallow in your discomfort. And that tendency gets reinforced by this use of dystopia.
Yeah, it's almost the opposite right now. I mean, dystopia had the function to warn us and make us think and act and critically think about the present. And now it's almost like, especially with the tendency of what I've called commercial dystopias to have happy endings, they become very reassuring, as Thomas said. In a way, we read and we exercise, our fears, and we pat ourselves on our back and say, well, good thing that I'm not living in that situation.
I'm going to thank you for your answer so far, and thank you for being here with us. And I'm going to move to the next question. I would just like to remind the people from the audience that we are going to be leaving some time for their questions. So if they have comments, questions, at the end, after our pre-selected questions, our pre-prepared questions, we will have some time for people to join us in this discussion. So I would just a reminder. And moving to the second question, I'm going to change it slightly because it's related to what Rafaela was saying now. It goes like this. Both of you edited the volume Dark Horizons in 2003. Putting together the different points of view of a group of academics who, like yourselves, identified a shift in the dystopian fiction near the end of the 20th century. As we could see, in resonance with the dark times we endure, dystopian fictions have proliferated in these 2 decades of the 21st century. However, although there are plenty of works that claim their consanguine relations with the dystopian tradition, something that is highly explored by the marketing companies that constantly seek to feed the audience ever-growing hunger for this kind of fiction, and an equal number of others that are read and analyzed through such perspectives, there is a clear difference between a novel like The Road by Cormac McCarthy and Huxley's Brave New World, and between the Mad trilogy by Atwood and Orwell's 1984. Or Zamiatin's We. How do you think that, because you said that dystopian fiction has undergone some transformation, so my question would be to change and ask, how do you think this transformation occurs? Is it in the level of theme or form, both, in these last 2 decades?
Okay, should I start this one?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, as you said, we already mentioned that dystopia has indeed changed, and as also Tom said earlier, dystopia and utopia always reflect the historical moment in which they're written. So the historical moment has changed, and therefore also dystopia has changed. I would say that in your question, there's already a difference between what we've called the classical dystopias of Huxley and Orwell and the critical dystopias of the 80s and 90s. But now there's a change also, right, from the critical dystopias of the 80s and 90s and today's dystopias. And I think there's a change at the level of themes. Reflecting, some of the central issues, some of the central problems that we're facing today. So what is called the cli-fi, the climate fiction, is probably one of the genre today that is most written about. The kind of apocalyptic and disaster novels, movies. Like The Road, to a certain extent. And of course, with today's pandemics, I think we're going to see a rise also of that theme in the next months. Because of the situation, I think there's been a return with the election of people like Trump and Bolsonaro and the sovereignist in Poland and Hungary, on the theme of women's rights, abortion, reproduction, rape, those have become once again central to the dystopias that are being written today. Migration is certainly another theme that is coming to the recent dystopias. Technology and the internet, even more so, and also everyday life. As we were saying before, these dystopias describe the present. They talk about everyday people, and in a way, they focus more on the individual. I would say more so than ever, although there are still elements of collectivity, which you can, and I, what I think is there in some of the good dystopias that we're reading today. I think another theme or another word that for me would be a key word is the idea of interdependence. We are interdependent, and we have to deal with that, despite the isolation, despite the the populism and the sovereignism, that rhetoric that we're facing. But maybe I'll stop here and I'll let Tom continue.
Okay, yeah, I'd agree, and the other thing that's core to all these, which is still quite active in the tradition of the critical dystopia, is an exercise of hope. Mm-hmm. It's not the collapse into the one-dimensionality of either the commercial dystopian narratives we'll be talking about later, or the sort of commodified dystopias out in the culture. But to go another step with Raffaella, I certainly agree with the thematic shift, and these are important, but maybe to say a few more things on the form and the formal change, because it has shifted yet again, and of course it would. Mm-hmm. There is, as Raffaella said, the shift to the individual, but of course there's always the individual in the dystopian, the protagonist who is caught in the world and who discovers her or his world to be totally inadequate, oppressive, terrible, and makes a break from it and makes a move. This is the key narrative of dystopia, just like the narrative of discovery and exploration and enlightenment is to the e-utopian novel. But this one is closer to our present. So the temporal situation is, whereas cyberpunk was once 20 minutes into the future, the newer dystopias, at least since the year 2000, maybe a bit before that, are just a shade into the present, if not into the future, if not in the very present in which we live. And the focus then is, and what we get formally is a narrative, our narratives that focus more on the individual making their way through everyday life, not on a systemic discovery of how the entire utopia or dystopian system, the oppressive system, works, and not an ultimate transformation of that system, but a discovery of the oppressiveness of everyday life. And through that, discovering the terror of the system. So that the narrative form itself is much more fragmented to go along with this. And we then work immersed within that present of the dystopian world, just as we, the readers, are immersed in the present of our dystopian world. experiencing it in a fragmented way, reading a narrative which is fragmented, experiencing it. Although there is a central protagonist often, as Raffaella said, there are multiple viewpoints being developed in the course of any narrative. And even though the protagonists, and we'll get to some titles later, reach a utopian standpoint or enclave or opposition, because of this fragmented quality and because of the multiple characters developed, there is exactly what Raffaella was saying about interdependence, an intersectional collective sensibility that's there in the character development.
On the formal level, I would say I would also add that you still have the feature of genre blurring in some of the recent dystopias. So you have and a mixture also of genre, like you have the dystopian narrative, but you also have biographies or the witness, the literature of witness. You have magic realism to some extent, so some use of fantasy. So that element is also present. And as Tom was saying, there's yes, a kind of utopian standpoint or stance that is reached. There's hope within. There's still hope within the pages of the dystopia, but it's usually it's a very small step, right? It's a very small change in the lives of the protagonist, of the individual, sometimes at a very personal level. But because of those multiple points of view, and because of those, because of that interdependence, it also has a kind of more collective feeling as well.
Yeah, I think that the small steps are important. I use the term critical dystopian. Obviously, the critical dystopias we wrote about originally in the 90s had their own particular moment of historical emergence and form. And but for lack of a better word or term, I think these current dystopias at least have that critical dystopian sensibility. But there's less systemic transformation, but there are these very important small steps. And I think in that way, they really speak to today's readers, not just the young adult readers who are really reading them a lot, apparently, but to all of us, because we're caught within that. At least with the critical dystopias, there still was a memory of a previous moment that could be looked back at, whether it worked or not. But now the present is so enclosed in this dark mirror that it's a struggle to even start to work a way beyond it. And that's why the multiple narrator, or the small steps of the narrator and the multiple characters the narrator or the protagonist runs into are important. And in this, I want to maybe step back a little to the function of dystopia. Phil Wegner talks about the dystopia as a pedagogical genre, in the sense that its aim is to educate the reader's desire for change. And here I want to bring in a term that Istvan Cicere-Ronay has used, and more recently Rebecca Evans in science fiction studies, and that's the term science fictionality, or that quality of reading that the science fiction text enacts in its pages by way of estrangement, by way of opening up a possibility of critique, and reading the present from a critical perspective so that we become strangers in a familiar land. And in that sense, the science fictionality names the reading protocol that is made available by this genre, which indeed is what makes it potentially so subversive. And I would say that there's a similar, the word gets too awkward, but a dystopian quality that's like the science fictionality. A good dystopian narrative works with the reader and teaches the reader as we read it to step outside beyond the pages and look at our own world. And in that sense, and I'll get to the Dystopia project later, one of the things we've been talking about there is whether we speak of a dystopian hermeneutic or a dystopian way of interpreting both to critique and to change the world. And so I think that's an evolving conversation that many of us are sharing, Raffaella and I and others.
Yeah. When we talk about, I totally agree with what Thomas said, and at the same time, I always feel a little worried, on how I phrase these things, because I really do think that this is what dystopia should do, but then I feel like I'm being a little too prescriptive. So I don't want to risk, I don't want to run the risk of being prescriptive, but I do think that a good dystopia is the one that leaves you uncomfortable in a way, that doesn't reassure you, that doesn't, when you close the book, you continue thinking about it. And that's, where the other kind of dystopias, the one that are flourishing today, and there's a huge market out there that we've called commercial dystopias. That's where they come in and and become more more kind of compensation and reassuring kind of work.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on that prescriptive thing. I totally agree. What even, a good literary dystopia is not a revolutionary manual. Mm-hmm. It doesn't outline the correct steps to be taken, much as I might, favor Lenin in some cases. We don't get that in the narrative. What we get is exactly what happened in the critical utopias and the critical dystopias, and that's the move away from blueprint, either of the design of the society or the design of the way in which the society is known epistemologically and changed. So it's that dystopian reading protocol is one that invites and teaches us to read the signs of our times, to go back to liberation theology for a second, and to see our process of reading, dropping the veil of our ignorance and our complicity with the system, and acting differently. But the acting only happens by way of the small steps coming out of the situation of the people. And we see that in many of the contemporary narratives. I'm reminded of a favorite story of mine by the Zapatista leader in his collection, Zapatista Stories, and the old Antonio stories. It's one called The Way. And the commander and old Antonio get lost in the forest, and the commander wants to get out his compass and his orienteering gear, and old Antonio just keeps walking. And he says at the end, they get home, and Commandante says, "How did you get home?" And he said, "We got there because that was our way to get there. Step by step, we found our way." And I think that's really powerful. But yeah, I don't think either of us would want to step back into prescription.
Okay, thank you one more time. I think Elton has lost his connection, but he will come back. Yes, I think it's very important for me to hear some things you are pointing, because in my own research, I have already find some of these characteristics, like the multiple perspective of the narrative. Yeah, and it's very important if you think from the utopian point of view, like you implode this logic of the hero's journey, and you have a more collective way of acting. It's nice. It's nice. So let's move to the next question. In recent papers, both of you complain about dystopian novels that do not challenge the social structures in the world outside fiction. It's what you are talking about right now, right? Or that go easily to in the direction of a commodified happy end. And in doing so, these fictional works fail in the sense that they are not able to raise the reader's awareness regarding the world he lives in. At the same time, both of you give examples of dystopian narratives that have the power to offer the readers the possibility of seeing their own world in a more critical way, by revealing the dangers of the present and its possible outcomes, and inviting these readers to envision a horizon of hope, therefore utopian, articulated in the very pages of these fictional words. As examples of such narratives, Baccolini mentions the novel The Red Cloaks by Benicio and Moylan, American War by Omar El-Akkad. First of all, what do you have to say about the former, those narratives that Baccolini calls commercial dystopias, and according to Moylan, quoting the writer Vandana Singh, are part of a contemporary dystopian form, which, as you read them, instead of hope, provoke more despair and apathy on the readers. And thinking about that other kind of narrative, such as Zuma's and Akkad's, why do you think they are more hopeful? Which political and literary aspects do these novels portray that allow you to read them based on a more hopeful approach? Could you give more examples of this kind of fiction in contemporary literature?
Okay.
Yeah.
I think the first part you have already answered, right?
Well, yeah, partly. I'd say, in a way, the cooptation of utopia, I think, was one of the reasons why a number of us, including Ildney and myself, Tom, and other people, turned to dystopia because, you know, the as I was saying before, the fact that every kind of desire had become utopian had, you know, taken away the meaning of utopia. And I think that something similar is happening to dystopia today, you know, with what I've called the cooptation, the commercialization of dystopia. And I would say that you can see that especially in the many trilogies, you know, that are coming out for young adults after the success of Susan Collins' Hunger Games. We've had tons of, you know, dystopian cycles, pretty much, all with the same kind of plot. You know, one example for me that really captures the marketing around dystopia is the Divergent trilogy by Veronica Roth. You know, popular book, has become made into films, and you know, it describes this world divided into factions, 5 different factions. And of course, in the first book, the publisher attached some 70 pages at the end of the book, full of the Divergent music list, the tips about all sorts of things, interviews with the author, quotes. But at some point, and of course, this is a marketing strategy, right? And I know that the author is not at fault. This is what the publisher probably decides. But at what point in this long extra work, there's also a quiz, right? That asks readers a certain number of questions, and at the end of the quiz, you find out which faction represents you. So the very idea of a world divided into factions that is questioned in the book becomes a game, where the readers are called into participating. And, and as I'm saying, probably this is the marketing department of the publisher. But then, in the last volume of the Divergent trilogy, in the final acknowledgments of the author, she thanks a number of readers that she divides into factions once again. So once again, the very system that is questioned, become part of her rhetoric, and in each reader, each faction has a leader into one of the fans, and you really wonder, how are these kids what are supposed to take home, right, from this novel that is questioning the system, but then replicating it at the same time. So this would be, one of the ways in which, these dystopias have lost their radical power and that made commercial. The other case that is incredible, I think, is The Handmaid's Tale. And Ildney was saying that I'm kind of working again. I'm still working on The Handmaid's Tale, partly because of what has happened, right? The election of Trump, but also a number of other things have made The Handmaid's Tale once again very fashionable. In the bestseller lists of 2016 and 2017. And part of it was also the adaptation in the TV series. And there, I think we have an example of what Tom was saying before, the dystopia porn. After the first season, which actually, I think, did something interesting to the book, by highlighting, for example, the LGBTQ theme with respect to the novel, or the racial issue. It's certainly more present in the adaptation than it is in the book. After the first season, though, the other seasons, I have to admit that I kind of stopped watching them, because it's like it's just dystopian porn. It's just pleasure in seeing these poor handmaids being abused and battered and raped and we've seen it all, and there's no much point in advancing I think that story. But at the same time, you have the iconic image of the handmaid's dress, right? That has been used, and I think positively, in rallies and marches all over really the world, because in Poland, in Italy, in the United States, in Brazil, in Argentina, I've seen hundreds of pictures. But then you also have the sexy handmade costume for Halloween, or there's lingerie, or designers that have used the appropriated the image. And so once again, these things kind of lose their power, most of all. I would stop here. I just talked about the commercialization, but I'll let Tom talk about something more, and then I'll join in again.
Okay, if this is not an example we talked about, Raffaella, but I'm just thinking more of a third example along the line you're talking, and that's the Hunger Games themselves, and particularly Franco Berardi critique of it, where he reads Katniss as the perfect neoliberal subject for dystopian times, just as the utopian sensibility of the 70s, it's been argued, at least one countercultural line of that produced not radical transformative subjects, but really good neoliberal entrepreneurs. What we get in Hunger Games, and also then in Divergent, is the single individual who makes it through, who wins the game, who triumphs over and over and over. And so that Hunger Games becomes to dystopia what Ayn Rand was to utopia in its time. And I think there's some great research to be done. I haven't done it, but I think a great project would be a reading of the Dark Mirror series. Because I think that series is caught right at the cusp of these two tendencies, the commercial and the critical. And it would take a text by text analysis, but I think that would be really revealing, and it would be a great individual or indeed a collective research project. But yeah, maybe we could get ourselves out of the dark slough of despond and talk about some of the novels that Felipe was mentioning, the ones that really are still critically dystopian. You mentioned Atwood and Akkad, but also we've been talking about Lenny Zuma's Red Clocks, Mohsin Hamid's Exit West. For me, lately, I have finally discovered, now that Becoming is done, I'm catching up barely, Cory Doctorow, and I'm just really immersed in his Homeland series. And I think these dystopias really go a much different direction than the commercial tendency that Raffaella was talking about. Others, Station 11, The Power, The Book of Joan, even Robinson's New York 2140. But I don't know, Raffaella, do you want to talk about some of these? We can go back and forth on this.
Sure. Well, I would, the question was what makes them, right, hopeful? And I think in part we've mentioned it already, but one of the things about Red Clocks, but I would say of all these novels that Thomas mentioned, is the multiple point of view, and that interdependence. Although there's especially in Red Clocks, I would say that we follow the story of these different women, but also how their lives intersect. And what I like is that Zuma's does not choose the easy way out. Right? She doesn't choose a reassuring ending. But in a way, she leaves her protagonist, if the teacher is the protagonist. I think they're all protagonists to some extent, but I think that the teacher is the one that we follow more than all the others. And so she's not really happy at the end, but she's done something very good for her student, and that individual choice has done something collective, has brought a change that, to go back to what I was saying earlier, right? That shows the interdependence among these women, and I would say that the interdependence and the multiple point of view is what makes them, what gives the collective dimension to these very individual stories. So that would be one way to keep hope within the book. And in a way, all the stories are really broken down, like the Testament by Atwood, which I still have to work on that. But I thought it was an interesting. I thought it was a smart book. The fact that she didn't follow, Offred's story, that she went a different direction. I thought it was interesting and it was smart. I'm a little disappointed, I think, about the ending. The ending is a little bit too happy, I think. Although she once again compensate this time the ending with the afterword, with the notes. The notes are also very important in the Testament, as they are in the Handmaid's Tale. Something that unfortunately any kind of adaptation has left out. Like Handmaid's Tale has been adapted in ballet, opera, drama, film, TV series, all sorts of things, but nobody's really worked the afterword in the adaptation, and I think it's a very, very important part of the story. So maybe those are some examples of the other things that you were asking. What else?
Could I just
Sure.
jump on those?
Yep.
Follow up on those particular ones. Yeah, I really think Red Clocks is a very powerful work, and it's deceivingly powerful. It's subversively powerful because you have these four characters: the teacher, the wife, the student, the healer. Each of them runs dead on into an economic and a patriarchal system that does them in, and each of them finds their way through it, but in very interesting ways, in that kind of intersectional, interdependent way that you're talking about, Raffaella, by helping each other, not overtly, although sometimes overtly. And each of them arrives somewhere new. There is a novum, to bring up the word at the end. It's not a transformed society. It's not a utopian. It's hardly even a utopian enclave. But there is that sense of the Women's Center. There is that sense of the clinic. And there is that sense that there's a larger resistance out there. And one, at least a reader like me, gets the feeling that these four are going to be in touch. So there is something very hopeful in the narrative unfolding. We're not told it; we're brought through it, and the same thing with the Testaments. Yes, it's Aunt Lydia who dominates, but it's the sisters who really carry off the action. But as I find often in Atwood, it's the process that's really compelling, and the ending just kind of wraps it up a little too tightly. So I'd agree there. Do we want to talk about Exit West?
Sure.
Which I think is another very interesting dystopian narrative of this critical, hopeful form. You have two characters who begin, and it's a novel of migration, and I think that's very important given what we were saying earlier about the themes. And it's about migration and survival, but not just survival, but triumph. Working as two individuals who become a couple, but then who decouple and find their own narrative outcomes, both ending in a more or less utopian enclave in California. So that once again, California iconically figures as a utopian space. I just think it's a very powerfully subversive novel. But the only other thing I'll add is the fact that a number of these books are about a person writing a book. Akkad's American War, the Testaments, and even Red Clocks. And I think there's something very self-reflective and again, pedagogical going on here between author and reader, in that we're being brought through in each of these narratives and others a tale of writing and a tale of reading. And I think more can be done in this direction. Anyway, that's...
Yeah, and it's a very interesting book because also and very powerful because as science fiction goes, doesn't really have any science in it. It reminds me to some extent of Octavia Butler's Kindred, where you have the journey, the time travel that is not explained, that cannot be explained. And here you have the doors. So there's that use of fantasy and people have also called it kind of magical realism that changes the genre to some extent. But I think it's a very powerful and important book because of the theme.
Do you want to ask another, or can we keep going here with this? Or
yeah, I think we should move because of constraints of time. We should move to the questions from the audience, and after those, we are going to end with one of ours, and I think that will be better. So Mark Matias asked, if dystopia is currently set in the present, is it possible to say that it has changed roles with utopia, in the sense that utopia is now set in the future?
So that utopia is representing the future, or?
Yeah.
Well, in a way, I mean, I'm just, off the top of my head, in a way, utopia always, represents the future. The not yet, to some extent. So I'm not sure whether they exchange roles. I think that they've become closer to some extent with the critical dystopia, in that I think a utopian horizon can be maintained within the dystopia.
I think that the utopian imagination is playing out in both the utopian, literary utopia, and the dystopia. Some more than others, as we said with the critical dystopia. Some of them fall all the way into total resignation and become no longer critical dystopias, so that utopia completely collapses. But what we've been pointing out in these works are sort of micro steps toward micro utopian moments that are there and are available. I don't know, the present utopias that do describe a future, of course, that future is always the future of our present, and they revolve back to being a meditation on our present. But I think, I don't know, I'd have to think more about it, but I guess I'd resist the binary.
Mm-hmm.
I'd resist putting the two opposite each other and can continually look for ways in which they interrelate.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah.
But thank you.
Felipe, would you like to ask the other one, or should I keep asking the questions from the audience?
No, I can ask the other ones from Jaqueline Bondonada, right? The next question. Yes?
Okay.
That's it.
Okay, so she said that there's a general, although loose, idea that dystopia represents a lack of hope in the future. And she says, I rather think it's the other way around. What are your thoughts on this idea?
Well, yeah, I guess I would say that my idea of dystopia is exactly in a way that it starts with a problem, in the present that you don't want to exacerbate and become worse. So in that sense of a warning. So I would say that dystopia, writing a dystopia, for me, it's a hopeful movement. I write a dystopia because I want to keep hope in the future and in the present. So not only in the future, but particularly in the present, by critically engaging my readers, I would say.
Yeah, to go back to the distinction we've been making between the commercial and the critical dystopia, I think the commercial dystopia, or I'd even go so far as to call it the neoliberal dystopia, mm-hmm. It's in the interest of that narrative to deny hope. It's in the interest of the anti-utopian persuasion to deny hope. And the way that the commercial commodification or alienation of dystopia has happened, either as the cultural form we talked about or in these narratives, is to crush hope so that one can only find pleasure in the present, or to so limit hope that it's seen as a very minor victory for the individual, so that hope is really deconstructed. Hope is under erasure in the neoliberal dystopia, whereas I think it's inherent in the critical dystopian imagination of whatever era we're looking at, from the machine stops all the way to the present, that hope is there. Kim Stanley Robinson really recently said in a talk he was giving here in Ireland at the Eco Village, an online talk, that he came out and said, hope, somebody said to define hope, and he said, hope is a political action. And it's a political standpoint. And there are tendencies in the neoliberal imagination, whether they're academic or whether they're commercial, to deny hope. But I think in the dystopian novels we've been talking positively about, I think they're really seething with hope.
Mm-hmm.
The next question is by Eloise Monteiro Vasconcelos, and she asks, do you think that the change in regard to time span when it comes to dystopia and utopia switching places, can be a reflection of people's dissatisfaction with aspects of everyday life nowadays.
Yeah, I think that's what these very interesting dystopias are about. And that's why, as opposed to Winston finding his way through and against the system, or even Butler's characters or Piercy's characters, these are people immersed in everyday life, and it's especially take Exit West, for example. Mm-hmm. The sheer survival that almost goes through the quantitative survival, almost reaches a qualitative change and becomes utopian. And so that's why when Raffaella mentioned the themes, everyday life is very much about that.
Yeah, I would, I totally agree with Tom. There's not much I could add.
Okay, so now we have Jorge Amaral's question, and he asks, how is it possible to prevent the utopian-dystopian impulse of a narrative from being absorbed by the logic of capitalism so that it can remain critical?
Can you repeat that?
Of course. How is it possible to prevent the utopian-dystopian impulse of a narrative from being absorbed by the logic of capitalism so that it can remain critical?
Okay.
Well, I think one answer I would give is a favorite phrase of utopian critics like Jameson and others, and we've used it. That's the politics of form. That there is this commercial tendency to generate utopian narratives where someone is just lost in the dark present, or the singular person like Katniss survives or in Divergent. So there the narrative gives way to its development within a neoliberal logic of only individual survival. But a critically creative dystopian imaginary that's working its way through the world that we live in, it seems that we have a bunch of writers who are doing something very different, who are working with form in a way that works against this. And Raffaella mentioned it, the multiple points of view, the fragmentary nature, the use of genre blurring to keep shifting our readerly attention so we don't just settle into the comfort of a particular form of fantasy narrative or whatever. I think there is a critical formal intervention that's there, because if you don't go through that gestalt shift, if you don't go through that kind of break with your formation within the logic of the society we live in, you're going to get this reproduction of these very resigned dystopian narratives. But I think it has to happen not just at the level of theme, it has to happen at the level of form. And to analyze dystopias only at the level of theme is to not do justice to the power of the form.
Yeah, I was going to repeat myself. So, but Thomas already mentioned it. I was thinking in terms of form myself, and the multiple points of view, and I would say I think something that really, for me, it's really fundamental in my reading of dystopias is the ending, and open ending, uncomfortable ending, it's one way of maintaining that critical thinking, as opposed to the apprehending of, and Tom was mentioning before, Hunger Games, that we hadn't talked about earlier in our conversations. But if you think about that, it ends with a very traditional nuclear family, with Katniss marrying Peter and having children, and so and to me, that's the problem also of a book that is totally different, but to me problematic, like The Road by Cormac McCarthy. Because the ending is once again the nuclear family, and such a bleak narrative as all of a sudden a kind of happy ending, although open as well, but gearing towards the happy ending. So I would think that the ending is an essential quality also of dystopias, to maintain the critical thinking.
I think we do not have any other questions
Yes,
from the audience.
I was going to say this, Elton, because we are moving towards the end. So I think someone said, Felipe said, you have a final question. So maybe you should ask that final question to end our meeting.
Yes, for sure. And I think if you want to organize your answers in this sense of also giving final remarks or things we haven't asked and you would like to say or express, please feel free to do that. And our final question, or our question for the moment at least, what does being utopian mean today? How can we fight the commonsensical view of utopia as a distant or impossible dream, spreading to other contexts within and outside the academy, the new possibilities of the concept practiced?
Should I go? Or
Yeah, go ahead.
okay. Well, when I thought about, and Tom can certainly talk about, is becoming utopian recent work, but being utopian for me has a number of keywords, and so the first one would be an activist. Be an activist within and outside the academy, the university. I think that would be my first answer. Being utopian also would also mean to be feminist. I don't think a utopia can exist without feminism, without the equality and acceptance of differences and diversity and respect for diversity. The other words that I would use are solidarity, but also kindness. Kindness is has been very disqualified in the present, right? Being kind is equals being weak, being feeble, and it's become a feminine quality. A real man is not kind, cannot be kind, and so kindness would be another utopian quality for me. And all this linked with also intersectionality, an intersectional approach that keeps together the diversity that I was talking about. And so those would be some of the things that come to mind that I associate with utopia. So to use Lyman Tower Sargent, it's not just dreams, it's not just desire, but it's also action. It's also critical thinking, teaching and bringing dystopia and utopia within the classroom, and choosing utopia.
Well, I could just walk away now because I completely agree, but I'll go on. But yeah, there's a reason why we collaborate the way we do. There is in theoretical / academic discourse a similar tendency to what we've been saying about the commercial dystopia, and that is at the very time when that kind of utopianism and utopian subjectivity that Raffaella just powerfully described, at the very time that's needed, there's a pullback to reduce utopia to an object of study and to keep it safely contained, neat and clean and well advised, as the line goes in West Side Story, as an object of study, so that objective studies, empirical studies, surface readings of utopia can be conducted. And I think for me, it's important to move beyond that kind of scholarship. I know it sounds pompous, but it's an old and I think honorable phrase. The term of an engaged intellectual, I think, is really important. That we're not spending this time doing really rigorous scholarly research. Not saying we're not doing that on utopia, but we're doing it from a standpoint that is engaged in the world, as Raffaella described, and it brings that work out in our scholarship, definitely in our teaching, and definitely in our lives as citizens and as activists. And that's why, becoming utopian became such a powerful kind of summary. I don't want to say it's the last thing I'll ever say, but it's a sum total of a lot of work that leads to that. So that being utopian means acting, and to pick up on what Raffaella said about kindness, I think for me, the two key terms are compassion and cooperation. Maybe you could add collaboration. We're only going to get there collectively, as we're doing today, as this group is. And I didn't talk a lot about the Dystopia Project, but that's a group of people who are doing this kind of collective research. And we now reach out to you doing your research. And I think these small, flexible networks, Darren Webb's Pedagogies of Hope group in Sheffield, these are very important moves within and without the academy, and I think that's very important. I'll just end with Donna Haraway. We have to stay with the trouble, and we have to make things change within that.
Yeah, I like not that I have much to add, but I like the idea of being a collective. And I feel like I'm part of a collective in this talk today, and in the work that we're doing in the Dystopia Project, and in the work that we're doing with the Raleigh series. I really like being part of collective. I think that's really important.
And the value of dialogue. I mean, our dialogue, Raffaella, that's been going on for a long time. We both bring something to the table, but then it goes somewhere else. There's a third stage that comes out of that dialogue, and now the dialogue grows, and that is utopian. Mm-hmm. And that's the kind of, because if we don't have that kind of utopianism, the kind of singularity of of the systemic world we live in, both in the academy and outside the academy, is going to squash us.
Thank you very much, Tom and Rafaela. Elton and Felipe, would you have more questions? Or?
I just want to thank again Moylan and Baccolini and you, Ildney, for the moderation. Okay, it was a very, very inspiring moment. And as you both said, utopian, yeah?
Well, thank you, really.
Yeah, we have like prepared some 4 or 5 more questions and some extra questions because we were very curious about many things, but we were sure we would not have the time to do or to ask all those questions. Then I think it's like this indicates it's necessary for us to meet again in the future so we can ask more questions and keep this going. And the questions are there. I mean, the curiosity is still there, but I think everything you just told us is so important for us to reflect and you know, to develop, to keep thinking about these topics. And I'm so grateful.
Yeah, as Raphael said, it is a process.
Thank you very, very much. There are so many things to, as Elton just said, to go on talking about. I'm sure this is a process. I'm sure we are going to carry on this conversation. And talking about conversation, talking about interviews. 2 years ago, I interviewed Tom, and the publication of the interview is going to happen finally later on this year. It's been, some time. That was before the presidential elections that changed our lives for worse. And so many bad things happened in between, but in the end, it's going to circulate in Portuguese. And Felipe translated the interview that is in Fantástica 451's next issue that is coming out later this month, I think. So maybe in the future, we could think of doing an interview with Rafaela, to have the pair, to have both of you in Fantástica 451. And one thing that Tom said in his final commentary that is very similar to what we think in our research group, Rafaela also mentioned the same thing, is the importance of collective action. And this is a learning that Utopian Studies has brought me, that illuminates our lives here, my own life as a scholar, and our actions at Literatura Utopia, as we try to go beyond, academic knowledge, and we open up space for the arts and for activism. There is part of our group that promotes, actions to do with social issues. So I think these are some of the ways in which we can, collectively build and rebuild utopianism for the 21st century. And thank you so much. A final remark is that Tom Moylan's new book is Bloomsbury publication. And we are going to post a flyer for a discount for all the people who have registered in our event, right? So thank you for this, Tom. And we know it's still expensive for a Brazilian readership, but we can at least try to have some institutions by the volume in which the most important point is, in its cover, becoming utopian is urgent. So let's read it, let's share the ideas, let's keep on the conversation. Thank you so much. And for the people following the colloquium, we are moving on to the next activity that's going to start at 5 o'clock with some announcements by our group, okay? Thank you so much, and let's keep in touch. Thank you, Felipe. Thank you, Elton, Tom Moylan, Raffaella Baccolini. Hope to meet you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Very much.
Thank you all.